Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Oh my God, today is the Girl Power Show. It's in the first hour, we're going to be speaking with Barbara Hand Clow about her book, Astrology and the Rising Kundalini, and Denise Lin in the second hour about the secret alchemy of food. And so just be prepared and put your little thinking caps on, because we're going to be covering some really interesting topics that I don't think many people talk about. But don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. And please do stop by the Just Energy Radio webpage. That's www.justenergyradio.com. And check out our over 6 years worth of archives. And while you're there, sign up for our weekly newsletter to keep you informed of all the programming that's coming up. You can also check out the show on YouTube on the Just Energy Radio YouTube channel. You can listen to it here live every Thursday evening on the Inception Radio Network, or you can come to the Inception Radio Network page and listen to the shows here. You can also download a cool little app that you can put on your phone and be notified of upcoming shows and listen to this show as well as all of the great programming here on Inception. Just a couple of quick little announcements. Tomorrow, if you're in the Texas, Oklahoma, whatever area, I will be at the Paranormal Times Paracon in El Reno, Oklahoma. I'll be speaking there and doing session work. And then, of course, one of my favorite shows that I mention over and over again throughout the year is the History, Haunts, and Legends Conference in spooky Jefferson, Texas, where I'll be speaking. And it's November 2nd. I think it's the first Saturday in November. And it is one of the top 10 haunted cities in the United States. So if you're in the Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, because it's kind of right in this border area, convergence of states, do check it out, because it's a fun event. It's just fun and it's spooky. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about Barbara and get her on the air. Barbara Hand Clow is the author of 11 books on the transformation of consciousness. Her best-selling book, The Palladian Agenda, A New Cosmology for the Age of Light, has sold over 100,000 copies, and her two latest books, The Mind Chronicles, Visionary Guides to Past Life, and The Mayan Code, Time Acceleration and the Awakening of the World Mind. She is a former editor of Bear & Company, published in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and now lives in British Columbia. So from www.handcloud2012, please welcome to Just Energy Radio, my good friend Barbara Hand Clow. Hey, Barbara, how are you?
I'm great, Rita. How are you? I haven't talked to you for a while.
I know. I'm just so excited that you have, yet another book coming out, because it always gives me an excuse to have you come on and have a great conversation with you.
Yes.
And so this book, Astrology and the Rising Kundalini, and where I was thinking about starting tonight was talking about the concept of Kundalini, because it's a topic I've not covered on the show ever. And I think it's a word that a lot of people maybe kind of have heard, but don't even know what it is. So
Okay.
could you fill us all in on what the Kundalini is?
Well, first of all, it probably would have been smarter if they just called it fire energy. It probably would have been easier for everybody rather than this difficult Indian word. But the concept of Kundalini has been primarily developed in Eastern medicine, and with acupuncture and with different forms of energy medicine. And so the West started realizing maybe 50 years ago that there was something going on with this, especially since so many people use acupuncture so effectively. So the basic issue with Kundalini is that we have a subtle energy system in our body that consists of chakras, which are energy centers, such as the Heart Chakra, where we work with receiving emotions. And then the energy centers in the body have different channels going through the body, and they have all kinds of complicated names too. But acupuncturists can work with these channels by using needles in order to encourage the flow in this subtle energy system. And so the reason I got into this material is that I've been an astrologer for 40 years, and I started to notice that the degree of energy flow with Kundalini energy was related to astrological transits frequently. So this book is really a book about how astrology relates to the issue of subtle energy in our bodies.
Interesting. I mean, when I've heard of, people talk about Kundalini, there was always this notion that, if you meditated a lot and meditated on your Kundalini, that you could get it to rise. But they don't really tell you what the purpose is or what the value is of having your Kundalini rise.
Yeah, this is really true. And actually, the reason I wrote this, now this book originally came out in 1991. And I'm the person who came up with the hypothesis about astrological transits and this energy. And the reason I wrote the book originally was that I was out in California in the 60s and 70s when all of the Eastern meditators were coming into the United States and were having big workshops and classes and teaching people how to meditate and do breathing exercises so that they could cause Kundalini rising. But all I saw from people doing that was an awful lot of problems. And very quickly, the Stanislav Graf in California started referring to spiritual emergency, which is a term that covers what can happen when people have Kundalini rising. And so my book is all about how we should not be trying to trigger this kind of energy, especially for people under 40. But at the same time, what I noticed as an astrologer was at certain times in people's lives, even if they don't do anything, this energy does rise in their bodies. And what happens when the energy does rise is it really literally is like a rising fire in our systems, in our chakras, and in our subtle energy systems. And it really disorients people. It can make people have a lot of dietary issues and a lot of health issues. And it's one of those funny things in life where if you understand it, it's really not so bad, but it's very dangerous if you don't know what's going on.
I mean, I worked with I want to say young man, but he wasn't really young, but he was under 50. I mean, he was maybe in his 30s, and he was either Indian or Chinese. This is quite a while ago. And he was working on having his Kundalini rise, and it rose as far as his second chakra and got stuck. Mm-hmm. And was having a dickens of a time doing anything about it and getting it to move. And it was really creating a lot of havoc in him physically.
Yeah, that's right. It can create a lot of havoc, too, in terms of your sex life. Because if somebody has a lot of Kundalini energy in the second chakra, they can have a tendency to become pretty promiscuous. So it can create problems like that, too. And it can create, in that situation, it can create digestive issues, especially in the colon and stuff like that. And what did you do with him? Can you remember? Because what I advise in this book is when people actually are stuck, that's when I really, really favor acupuncture. Because acupuncture is a system that balances all of this energy in the body. And so about a series of 3, 4, or 5 acupuncture sessions will almost always get the energy to flow again and not be stuck.
I mean, I just did some energy work with him just to try to open it up and loosen it up for him.
Another thing, Rita, is that when I was working with this back in the 1970s and 1980s, speaking of the second chakra, another thing that I noticed with people was that a lot of people aren't grounded. Like, they're sitting in lotus position and they're not really connected to the earth. They're kind of sitting, it's almost as if they're on a magic carpet in lotus position, kind of trying to fly. And what happens is, with Kundalini energy, is if you aren't connected to the first chakra, which is the center of the earth, which is the same thing as being grounded, then the energy is way too juicy in your physical body. In other words, it's extremely important that this energy start in the first generation chakra and then rise through the body. So this could be another one of these situations that I saw so much of, especially in the past, where people were just getting way, way, way too jazzed and excited in the second chakra, and it was very unbalancing for people, very confusing.
Well, it might be kind of hot, Barbara. I don't know.
Well, yeah, but, if you depends on how hot you want it to be,
So how does all of this fit in with astrology? I mean, that was kind of the little bit of a mind blower. I'm like, Kundalini, astrology, how does that work?
Well, the way it works is that, and this is just something I discovered. If I hadn't been an astrologer, I never would have noticed it. But what I noticed after doing readings for around maybe 15, 20 years, I noticed that there were three really critical passages in everyone's life. The first one is around age 29 to 30. The second one is around 42 to 44. And then the third one is when we're around 50 years old. And there's other passages and other transits that we go through, but those three transits really have a profound impact on people, because the first one, which is age 29 to 30, is called Saturn Return. And this occurs when the planet Saturn goes all the way around the sun in relationship to your chart. It takes Saturn 29, 30 years to go around the sun. So then in terms of your natal chart, it comes back to that place when you're 29 or 30 years old. And what happens with people is, if you watch people's lives closely, or you watch your own life, literally 98% of people make a major change at age 29 to 30. They get married, or they get divorced, or they get a big job, or they have a child. Whatever they're going to do, they make some kind of major change in their lives, which enables them to pull it together at the kind of physical plane level, the practical level, because then from age 30 to 42, 44, they're going to be growing emotionally. And so the whole issue through the 30s and into the early 40s is emotional maturation. And this is where Kundalini energy really comes in, because after that Saturn return and the structure of the physical imprint of the person is relatively, it's kind of come into a form. A lot of people, when they're around 30 years old, feel like they're very young again once they get through this transit, because they're starting a whole new cycle. So you go into this new cycle of emotional maturation, and then what happens is you deal with all the aspects of emotionality, the dark and the light, deep feelings, family patterns, all the things that we do. What starts to happen is the body starts to quicken because of the emotional opening, and the heart starts to open. And this is when the Kundalini rising is preparing. The timing of the Kundalini rising is so important for people, because what happens with the second transit around age 42 to 44 is, what's going to happen then is that we're going to have an emotional developmental kind of crisis. We're going to go through some kind of real grappling and meeting with the real issue of what we feel in life. And for most people, midlife crisis is very difficult. I had fun in the book describing the differences between midlife crisis for men and midlife crisis for women, because it's actually kind of a different experience. And so if you get two people together who've been married for a long time and they're both the same age, then when they get midlife crisis, they have a hard time because they're both having a very different experience. So that's
and let's come back to that, after we kind of get through this cycle thing, because, I think that my listeners either are going to be going through that soon, or maybe have gone through it and didn't realize it.
Yeah, that's true. And one of the funny things about this book, now this book has been out since 1991, and this book also, by the way, has sold well over 100,000 copies. This has been a real kind of steady, popular book. And one of the things that this book has done is it's really helped people keep their marriages together. I think the reason that I love this book is because it has helped people deal with some really, really fundamental problems. But I'm trying to relate just to what you just said. You were just looking for something there.
Well, and I want to come back to it because I think that it's a really interesting topic. How they, the midlife crisis is different for men and women, and just what the symptoms of midlife crisis are. But you were kind of talking about the phase, the 42 to 44 transit. And I wanted to kind of keep going with that.
Okay, we'll keep a sense of that. We're both. I've got full moonitis. I don't know about you, but the full moon this morning was really something. Every time I try to settle down, I find myself flying out. But regarding what's going on at that point is that astrologically speaking, the reason I gave you a kind of moving target date there, somewhere between 42. It's actually between about 40 and 44. And there's tables at the end of the book. Like, nobody has to have an astrological chart in order to work with this book. It's all at the end of the book. Because with the midlife crisis transit, what's going on is we all have Uranus in our birth chart, and it takes Uranus 84 years to go around the sun. So if you cut 84 in half, you're going to get 42. But Uranus has a very elliptical orbit. So some people get their Uranus opposite Uranus. In other words, what we're talking about here is when does Uranus come to the point where it's opposite itself in terms of your natal chart. And the reason that's a big deal is that Uranus rules transformation and change. And so the maximum level of transformation and change that any of us experience is when Uranus comes to this opposition point. So for people who experience it when they're 38 or 30, it can be as young as 39, but it's basically 39 through 44. It's going to be very different, actually, if somebody's 39 years old versus 44, because people have matured quite a bit more even in those 4 to 5 years. But what happens is we get to this level of maximum transformation and change, and then the Kundalini rises through the chakra system and moves through the body and opens consciousness because we're coming into an emotional level of real deep maturation. So that's called midlife crisis. And what happens for people is that they often feel desperate. They often are afraid of what they're going to do with the rest of their lives. But for most people, to tell you the truth, what happens is all of the stuff that they thought was normal and all of the stuff that they thought they could count on just suddenly seems to be just changing. And it's like people feel like they're on a roller coaster. And the difference between men and women is that men, generally speaking, well, do we want to get into that?
No, let's come back to that.
Yeah, come back to that, because the difference between men and women is fascinating. Yeah.
And, one question, I mean, you're kind of giving this big window, but can it come early, or does it really, I'm reading the book and I'm kind of reflecting on my own life, and I'm like, well, I went through some of these changes, but it seemed like they were earlier, especially like the Saturn return,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, where it really seemed applicable to me was more 26, 27 versus 29, 30. So, I mean, can we actually start to experience the energy and start making these transformations before we actually get there?
Well, yeah, because first of all, there's different levels of growth that people are going through. And people who are more advanced, which obviously you are because of the kind of work you're doing, chances are you might work something out sooner that would have been like a crisis when you were like 29. But I bet if I sat down and talked to you, I bet we could nail the shift right at the point that Saturn comes back to its natal position. Because, Rita, it's so dramatic with people. Now, I agree with you that you might be working at a sort of more subtle, complex level, but with Saturn return, I basically find that people are following that one exactly. as I said to you, about 95 to 98% make a major shift at that point. With midlife crisis, what I find is only 10 or 15, maybe 20% of people make it. Now, what does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean?
From an astrologer's point of view, you have a natal chart which has all kinds of potential in it. And the potential in that chart is going to be triggered at different points. And remember, the transits we're talking about here aren't the only ones. There's hundreds of transits. We're just talking about these three major patterns. And so when we work with the client, the first thing we do is we ask you a few questions, because what we're looking for is to see whether you're responding to the energy in your chart. Because when people aren't responding to the energy in their chart, and you can detect it immediately, because when a certain point comes up, if nothing happens, you know that they're repressed and you're not responding. And so with Uranus opposite Uranus, the midlife crisis transit, a lot of people don't make it. The Saturn return is just pretty much ubiquitous. But when you get to midlife crisis, because see, midlife crisis is a propelling of the person into a level of transformation and growth. And not everybody does that. I'm sure you've noticed yourself. Some people just don't do it. Or another thing that will happen will be that people won't be able to handle the energy very well, and they'll do some of the things you can do at midlife crisis that get you into very big trouble.
You mean like go buy a new car or have an affair or, I don't know, quit their job or those kinds of things?
Sometimes that's the appropriate response, sometimes. But for the most part, at the time of Uranus opposite Uranus, that is the time to grow spiritually and start to transform yourself. And so if you turn your life into a soap opera at that point, you can wake up 2 or 3 years later with half of your life gone and you didn't accomplish anything. You follow what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you may buy a red sports car and get a girlfriend and leave behind your family. We're talking about men. See, men and women have very different responses to this pattern. For men, the tendency is to get very adventurous and men tend to have a lot of sexual conflict at this point, and they can get themselves into very, very big trouble. And that's why I said I love this book, because this book has saved a lot of marriages. The letters that I have on this book are really wonderful, from people who decided not to trash their lives because they decided to wait it out and use the energy more intelligently. Now, for women, what happens at midlife crisis is women want to go inward. Women want to get out of the family and out of ordinary reality, and they want to have a kind of an eat, pray, love phenomenon. They just want to go meditate. And so just imagine what happens when you have a man and a woman who are the same age, who are married, and one wants to go off and get a sports car and chase girls, and the other one wants to just meditate. And so it's one of those funny situations in life where if you have some understanding of what's going on, you can make some intelligent choices instead of just acting in the moment and acting rashly. And with the planet Uranus, people can really act in a very rash and crazy way.
Well, doesn't that have to do with, unexpected things and, kind of being crazy anyway?
It does, but it's one of those things where with understanding, you can use the energy to transform yourself and go to another level of consciousness rather than to be in the middle of a train wreck, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like I had, when I was counseling in Santa Fe, I often did couples and families because I like to do that. And I had a really interesting Swedish woman, and the family had 3 children. The kids were teenagers, and maybe one was 10 years old or whatever. And the woman all she'd been as a mom, had been a mom for like 15, 20 years and had no time for herself. She hit midlife crisis, and she was just desperate, and she was just ready to run away from the whole family. And so I talked to all of them and persuaded the husband that maybe if he could let her just go to Sweden for 6 months to a year, and it was no kidding how difficult that would be, But if he could somehow stand to let her go for a while, that she'd come back. And so she did. She went to Sweden for almost a year. And then she came back to her family and took over her role again. And they've been, as far as I know, as of 10 years ago, very happy. And so she could have run away and let her whole family go, not just a husband, but also 3 children.
Mm-hmm.
I
mean, that takes a definite level of maturity, both emotional and spiritual, to address something like that, and not have it fall apart.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I thought the husband was incredible. That he said, okay, if we need to do this, this is what we're going to do. And I had a minor version of that myself, actually. I haven't shared this in public before, but it's fine. When I hit midlife crisis, of course, I didn't know what was going on yet because I hadn't done this research. And so what I did basically when I hit this point is I just started to shake and sweat all the time. Because with Kundalini Rise, and it can cause you to shake and cause you to be really nervous. You can get tics from it. You can sweat, all kinds. You're just so energized that you can't cope. And so I went to my husband, and we had 4 children at home at the time. And I said, look, we've got a choice here. It's either an insane asylum for me or it's graduate school. Which do you take? So my husband quit his job and stayed home and took care of the household with 4 kids while I went to graduate school for a year. Isn't that amazing?
Mm-hmm.
And he says that it was this experience where he really learned what it was. He said he had no idea what I was doing. He thought I was just relaxing all day.
Bonbons. Just having some bonbons.
Yeah, and the youngest kids were 2 and 4, I think 18 months and 3.5 years old. And he found out. He went, I had no idea what you were going through while you were caring for those kids, and I went off to work. And it was a great experience for us because he understood my reality and I understood his better,
Mm-hmm. Well, with you talking, it's like I recall a different set of events that happened when I was 29 to 30.
Mm-hmm.
I decided to let go of my regular day job, went to the Berkeley Psychic Institute. I mean, I was still working. And then once I graduated from there, I quit.
Well,
and I haven't really had a day job since then.
Yeah, well, no, Rita, that's a classic Saturn return. See, what happens is you're stuck in something, whatever it is, a bad marriage, a job, or whatever you're stuck in. And then what happens is when that need to grow emotionally and then eventually, of course, spiritually starts to hit you, you've got to change something. And you did exactly the right thing. You quit your day job and you went into what you're really interested in. That's a perfect solution for that.
Da, 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 da.
You didn't do that when you were 27. You did that when you were 29, right?
No, but, I had a marriage end when I was 27. So I was like, that was, my life is, they could make a major motion picture out of my life, Barbara.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I try not to talk about mine that much. I suppose people wish I would, but
it's like, well, you can listen to this, but then I'd have to kill you.
Yeah. And so in this book, I also there's characters in here. Some of my relatives are in this book. It's really fun to do that. Like in the first chapter, it starts out with a man having midlife crisis who's watching girls in bikinis on the beach. And everybody who comes to our classes, they all know that's Jerry. In the book, he's called Bob. Jerry's my husband. But it is fun because the thing is, when you really know somebody really well, they're your best characters.
Mm-hmm.
I
know. In one of my books, and I'm trying to think which one it was. It was my 2x4 book, Avoiding the Cosmic 2x4 book. I changed the names of everybody except one. My son. I said, your name's going to stay the same because you were just a brat.
Did he mind?
He was a minor, so I didn't care. He might sue me later. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so there's one other transit that happens, and that's the Chyron return. And I think people aren't even familiar with what Chyron is and how it could possibly return. So maybe you can go into a little bit more depth on that one.
Sure. Yeah, and that research is coming from a book I wrote about Chyron called Chyron, Rainbow Bridge Between the Inner and Outer Planets, which has been a very popular astrology book. And what's going on with Chyron is that astronomers cited a body called Chyron in 1977, November 1st, 1977. And it orbits between Saturn and Uranus and dips into the inside of the orbit of Saturn a little bit, but it's basically between Saturn and Uranus. And when the astronomers first sighted Chyron, they called it a planet, and they kept on calling it a planet for about 20 years. Now they call it a planetoid. Some of them call it a small planet. There's a range of definitions of this little body. And it's very small, and it has a 50 to 51-year orbit around the sun. And Chiron's kind of like a homeopathic remedy. It's one of these intense little bodies that has a very, very huge impact. But it's like when you take a homeopathic remedy, you know, all you have is just a little bit of a white sugar pill and water. And what happens with Chyron is really one of the most intense processes that we experience as humans. But because we don't have much of an archetype for it, it's been something that's been very, very poorly understood. Mostly understood only by astrologers, and especially by me in that part of my research. Because Chyron is very, very elliptical. And so the major aspects that we get with Chyron are Chyron square Chyron, and then Chyron opposite Chyron, and then Chyron upper square Chyron, and then back to conjunction. If that's making any sense to people who are listening, it means that Chyron gets 90 degrees away from its location in the chart, then 180 degrees, and then to whatever the upper square is, and then back again to the conjunction. And so at these angular points with Chyron, people have really amazing spiritual experiences. Like if you watch people really closely, there are certain points in their lives when they suddenly just have a full-blown mystical experience and they can't even figure out what happened. I'm sure you're very familiar with this, where some people will just soar and get in touch with the higher planes, and then the experience is so bizarre and unlike ordinary reality that 2 or 3 days after they have the experience, they can't even remember it. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we work with people as astrologers, and what we use Chyron for is to help people get in touch with that spiritual contact that they're experiencing. A lot of people will have a really major spiritual experience when they're a child, when they get Chyron square Chyron. And then sometimes astrologers can take them back to that point and kind of help the person kind of connect up a little bit. So here's the interesting thing about this little body, Rita. Because it has a 50-year orbit, 50 to 51-year orbit, it's the planet that actually is part of our experience with our grandparents. Now, this cycle with Chyron is getting very screwed up now because a lot of people are having children for the first time in their 40s. But in the old days, people had their children when they were basically in their 20s, maybe early 30s. And what happened was the grandparents were really relating strongly to the children because due to this 50-year cycle, this is the cycle that relates grandparents to their grandchildren. And this is one of the reasons why people have very often have very strong spiritual connection with their grandparents because their grandparents are resonating with something that they're experiencing. So what else do you want to know about this? Of course, obviously at age 50, 51, we get the return. And at the time of the return, that's when we move out of this focus on emotional growth, and we start to become very, very spiritual at 50, 51.
I mean, one of the things that I've seen, and I'm going to say particularly in women, is that they get to a place where they want to regain or assert their power. You know, and it's kind of like, well, you know, this hasn't, you know, their children are grown. They have the empty nest thing going on, you know, and there's this whole energy of, well, now it's time to take care of me, you know, and how do I do that? So is that tied to that Chyron return?
It's related to it in the sense that, okay, you're 50 or say you're 50, 51 years old. You've never been able to do anything for yourself. The astrological time for you to get in connection with spiritual realities and you know, meditation and contact with spirit comes around. And if you don't do it at that point, in a sense, you're just going to dry up. It's like it's a very desperate need. And another thing that goes on with this is, let's go back to midlife crisis for a minute. And the purpose of midlife crisis is to go through an emotional evolvement and an emotional level of growth so that you can prepare yourself to develop at a spiritual level. So go back to age 42, say, and remember I mentioned to you that only 15 or 20% of people, as far as I can see and what I've been able to see so far. By the way, the numbers on people doing these transits and transformations are rising all the time. It's been really exciting to be a teacher for over 40 years because I've seen such major changes in people that I know that our species is getting someplace because of the changes that I see. But if we take a person who's around 42 and they don't do their midlife crisis, that is, they don't free themselves and start to transform, then when they hit 50 or 51, they have a serious crisis. And some of the most serious crises that I've seen with clients have been with people who are 49 to 51 to 52 who didn't do their Uranus opposite Uranus, and then they hit 50 and they just go into crisis. And they actually need a lot of counseling at that point. And people get that counseling in different ways.
I mean, can people live through these cycles and just not really respond to them or repress? I mean, because there's a lot of people that are just really repressed, and they live in the box and they live in this world of rules of how they're supposed to be. And can they go through these cycles and never really do anything with them? And if they don't, I mean, you're talking about when they get to be 51, they go into crisis, but can they even suppress that?
Okay, it's a really good question because, first of all, we're talking about people who don't know anything about what we're talking about here.
Well, yeah, that was
Nothing,
kind of the,
nothing.
yeah.
They don't know anything. And so what will happen with them is usually, as I said, at Saturn Return, they don't know why, but they just dump their job or they dump their whatever they do. They change it at Saturn Return. Thank goodness for that. Because if they didn't change it at that point, and after all, there are people who don't do anything at that point, and they end up on the street as a bum when they're 40 years old. We all know about that. But then when we get to these next two transits, there's an awful lot of people who have no idea what's going on. They don't have any way of doing anything because they don't understand. And here's what happens to them. They basically have a minor breakdown at around 42, and that's why people have made so many movies and written so many books about midlife crisis. Because lots of people have a very serious midlife crisis and they create a lot of wreckage in their lives, and they don't grow very much after that because, in other words, you've got a job to do at that point, which is to start to master yourself a little bit. And if you just create a train wreck, then you're in the middle of a train wreck, and it gets worse when you're 50 years old. And this is one of the reasons that people are taking so many mind-altering drugs and stuff like that. There's a whole lot of things that people are doing with these kind of problems and aren't helping at all, as far as I can see.
Well, no, it just keeps them in their little box because, they must be crazy.
Well, yeah, that's another thing that can happen, too, is people feel crazy. When people hit midlife crisis, when they get to that point where that transit is really affecting them, they do feel crazy. It's kind of like schizophrenia in a way, where with kids who have schizophrenic breakdowns, usually people break down when they're around 17, 18, 19 years old. That's the highest percentage of breakdowns. And what happens is young people just start to fragment because they can't put themselves together. And what I've experienced with that one is if there are people around young people who realize they're not crazy, and what they're doing actually at that point is they're going through an initiation. Because what's happening at that point is more complex levels of life are starting to present to the person, and the person's trying to cope with it. And if there's just people around them who understand, they can get through that. And obviously there are some people who just have severe metabolic disorders. There's no question about that. But I don't think that there's much understanding of what people are experiencing at that age. And then when you hit 42, 43, 44, it's pretty much the same thing. Except the culture at least makes a joke out of it.
Well, see, I always thought midlife crisis was when you were around 50. That's why I'm a little surprised where you're talking about 40 to 44. I always thought it was older.
Yeah. If you get into the literature outside of what I'm saying in my book, you'll see that most people focus on the mid 40s, 40 to 45.
Yeah.
So
I'm not arguing with you.
The timing here isn't my idea. In other words, in the culture, midlife crisis is pretty much considered to be the same timing. But that's not why I picked this timing. I picked this timing because of what I could see going on with people. And when Kundalini is rising in the body, it can create all kinds of problems in our spines. It can create backaches. It can create a tremendous amount of neck strain and stuff like that. And it is amazing when you're working as an astrologer, seeing people exhibit those symptoms exactly when Uranus comes opposite to Uranus. People started referring people all over the country to me as a result of this research, and because people were sending these really, really difficult cases. And some of the descriptions of what happens when this energy takes off are just incredible.
So our Kundalini rises, so does it stay risen? And, what is the impact, or how would we experience our Kundalini risen? And does it go up and down? What happens to it once it rises?
Yeah, the reason they use the term rising is because it starts in the lower chakras and then it gradually moves through the chakra systems in our bodies. And the reason that it works that way is because, take the solar plexus chakra right in the center, right in our gut. That's the part of our body that processes anger and processes complex emotions. And so once we get to the point where we are processing conflict pretty well and processing difficulties with people, then what happens is the energy can start to rise into the heart, and the heart chakra. And then what happens with the heart chakra is that people are able to start to feel other people, and people are able to feel them. Then the energy rises into the throat chakra, and at that point, what's happening is people are learning how to speak their truth. And then the energy rises into the third eye chakra, which is the point between our eyes and our forehead. And the third eye chakra involves seership. And so people start to realize they're speaking their truth and they're maturing fairly well. And then they start to have synchronicity experiences, and they start to see things in a psychic way. And that's a sign that the third eye is opening up. And then the energy rises into the crown chakra, which rises right through our bodies, and actually, in my system, actually rises right into the center of the galaxy. So what goes on with this energy is usually the first experience of it is it rising through the chakras, as I've just described. But then what happens is we start to enter into a circulation with the universe, and then the energy starts coming back down. And it starts coming from the spiritual realms and coming into the third eye where we can see, and then into the throat and going back down. So the energy both rises up and also descends. And then the other thing, there's another whole system in our body where the energy is working through different, these are terms people aren't going to know, but there's different energy systems in the body on the right and left side where the energy is like attempting to balance from left to right. That's the reason acupuncture helps so much. So to put it simply, Rita, the issue with Kundalini energy is it's a natural flow. It's a real natural energy flow. But it's just that if you don't understand what's happening and you think you're crazy, then it's difficult to have anything flow. You know how that is. And if people tell you you're crazy, that makes it even worse.
I just say, thank you. I already knew.
And not every, varying levels of response to this. Like, I responded to it pretty strong at a physical level when it was happening to me. But some people have a fairly gentle experience. It runs through a whole range, but the energy is palpable.
So we hit these returns, 29 to 30, 42 to 44, 51, these different pieces of cycles. And then what happens?
Then, of course, these transits keep on going. Okay, now, first of all, it takes Saturn 30 years to go around the sun. So therefore, we get another Saturn return at age 58 to 60. You see how that just keeps on going around? Some people live until they're 90, and they have 3 Saturn returns. So and by the way, these aren't the only cycles. There's a bunch of other major cycles that are in this book, but we're just talking about just these 3. And so, like with the first Saturn return, like in your case, dumping the day job and studying psychic work, which ended up being your life's work. With the second Saturn return at age 58 to 60, that's a real cool one as far as I'm concerned, because, okay, there you are, you're 58 to 60 years old. Hopefully you've done a lot in your life and you've accomplished a lot, at least in terms of what you'd like to do yourself. And when you get that second Saturn return, that's the time to decide to do what you really want. Because if you watch yourself from 29 to 58, you've been doing a whole lot of things and a lot of hard work and all that, and you haven't necessarily spent that much time doing what you really want to do. So these cycles just keep on going on. The midlife crisis transit, it occurs because Uranus is opposite Uranus when we're around 42. But then it takes Uranus 84 years to go around the sun. So at age 84, we get a Uranus return, which is the same thing as saying Saturn goes around. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so with Uranus return, that's when this is a period of a major enlightenment, and when people are 83 to 84 years old, if they're healthy enough to handle that kind of consciousness and that kind of energy. So these cycles keep going on and on. Astrology is all about timing all these cycles.
You know, what you were talking about, the Saturn return, about getting to do what you want to do. I mean, I still have another 30 years before I hit my next Saturn return.
Well, first of all, how old are you?
Shh. I have another 29 to 30 years before I hit my next Saturn return. Okay, so that's all I'm admitting to. And
but what I mean is you. Well, at any rate, I don't need to know how old you are, but
I would tell you personally, but I don't want to tell the entire planet.
Yeah, I understand that. That's okay. But I know you went through the first one. I know it was a while ago.
Yeah,
you dropped your day job and then changed your life. But
that was last week. It was last week.
What?
It was last week.
Last week.
Yeah.
Really?
No. No. But I just can't even imagine, having this opportunity to do what I want to do, because I've been doing what I want to do since my last one.
It's a deeper decision. It's a deeper decision. When I reached that point, all I really did was just clear away a few things that I didn't really like that much, and just made more space and time for the stuff that really counted. Like I'm in my case, I don't mind saying how old I am. I'm 70, and so I went through that like 10, 12 years ago or something like that. And what I wanted to do my whole life was write a novel. I've always wanted to write fiction. And so when I hit my second Saturn return, I started clearing things out of my life in order to make it possible for me to write fiction. And now I'm finally writing fiction.
How fun.
Yeah, I'm having a blast. I've never had so much fun in my whole life.
Huh.
But see, when I hit that point, my first book came out in 1976. And so when I first, I wanted to be a writer. And I didn't want to write novels like Michael Crichton or Stephen King. I didn't want to write ugly, violent stuff. If I was going to write novels, I wanted to write really good novels. And I realized back then that if I tried to publish it, I wouldn't get it published. So I wrote nonfiction for 30 years. Just to get myself to the point where now I can write nonfiction. So that now I can write fiction. In other words, I wrote nonfiction for 30 years, and now I'm able to write fiction.
But that's pretty cool.
Oh, it is pretty cool. I've never had so much fun in my whole life.
Well, I guess I have something to look forward to.
Oh, it's just delightful. I mean, it's really a wonderful experience. But I think certainly you would agree with me that when people get to be around 60, they start to really think about, okay, now I've done all these years, and now I want to think about what I'd like to do for a change.
Well, I think most people, when they hit 60, go, how many more years is it before I can retire? But, one of the things that I have found is that a lot of people do start thinking about what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And there's a whole group of people that, start working on their hobbies so that they can do that to maybe make a little money when they retire, or they start learning how to do gardening, and they start bringing in these things that they wanted to do, these hobbies. And it's the people that don't do that just, keep going to work every day like nothing's going on. And then they get the golden watch and a week later they're dead. I mean, I hate saying it, but it's true.
That's right. And these transits are really wonderful opportunities. People listening to the show could say, well, who needs astrology? But the best thing about astrology for me has always been that it'll tell you when something's over. Like people will get all messed up and just screwed up, and they'll go to an astrologer trying to figure out what's going on. And the astrologer can see, and the astrologer will say, well, this is what's going on, but here's the real news. It's going to end in 2 months. That's what people want to hear, you know what I mean? So the opposite is knowing about these opportunistic points, such as second Saturn return. And then what happens when you get to be about 58, 59, and that transit comes, you really feel like choosing what you want. It isn't just about an idea and, when I get to be 59, 60, I should plan for my retirement. You feel that you want that. And so when you're working with these transits effectively, they give you a tremendous amount of direction and energy. Astrology is really like that. It's a directive force.
I'm having like a little thing. I'm going to have to send you an email on a thought I have that's not really appropriate for on air.
Can we talk about sex?
Huh?
Can we talk about sex?
Okay. Well, I'm looking at the clock. It's like we can always talk about sex. I might blush a little bit.
No,
we have about 7 or 8 minutes.
But this particular 1 minute thing I'll explain is people have tried to give me $1,000 bills when they find out about this. So we'll put it over the air. Remember that description I did about 15 minutes ago of the energy going through the chakras? I'm going through the lower chakras and into the solar plexus, into the heart. That little description of energy rising. Well, what happens for men when that energy rises is they have a lot of problems with sexual dysfunction. And the reason for that is that men are holding the sexual force and the energy in their root chakra, which is what they do because they're men. And when that energy rises through the chakra system, basically a lot of men become impotent for 3 months, 6 months, or a year, or when they're right around 42, 44 years old. And this is the reason for the affairs. Because what does the guy do? The guy goes, well, it must be my wife. If I get a girlfriend, I'll be okay.
So if they get some, 20-something-year-old thing, they think that it's going to make their life better?
Yeah. But they think more specifically, they think it'll bring back their potency. And all that's going on, I've had with male clients, they just are so relieved when they hear, say, what's going on with me? I was fine until now, and then blam. And so what happens is this is a good example of just stay with what you're living with, because it's all going to straighten itself out anyway, and you don't have to wreck your whole life, by getting a 21-year-old at that point. And so I just wanted to bring that up because this is what's behind the midlife crisis issue for men. It's very difficult for them.
Well, I guess it's one thing that I guess I'm glad not to be some guy, huh?
Yeah, well, women have their own response to it, and women just get claustrophobic. And all they want to do is just get away from everything. And it can become just an obsessive pattern where if you can just relax with it and find ways to cope with it, it'll work itself out. Mm-hmm. But that energy really can affect people in those two ways very strongly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much you keep track of what's going on, but it just seems, and I'm going totally off topic here, but it just seems like there's been some really serious energy going on. Now, I know that we just went through a period where the moon was the closest to the Earth or the biggest or something in June. And then in August, we had a blue moon on my birthday. And then there's another major full moon going on now or coming up. I don't know. But do you know what's going on?
Yeah. That's, this is the funny thing about astrology is astrologers actually do know what's going on. And what we're in the middle of right now from 2012 through 2015, and even 2011 through 2016, but specifically 2012 to 2015, is a series of squares between the planet Uranus and the planet Pluto. And the reason those are such a big deal is because the way these now this is not an issue of a transit to your natal chart like we've been talking about on this show. Now I'm talking about like aspects that are like in the sky. And these kind of aspects affect the planet as a whole. They affect everybody. And so back in the 1960s, Uranus conjuncted Pluto. And the transit I'm talking about right now is about a 350-year transit altogether. But if we go back to the 1960s, Uranus conjuncted Pluto. Uranus rules transformation and radical change. And Pluto rules the deepest forces in the underworld that cause major transformational changes. In other words, those two planets are the planets that create change. So when they conjuncted in the 60s, you remember that one?
I was kind of young. I mean, I wasn't born yet, Barbara. That's it.
Yeah, but you heard about the 1960s, and I was a hippie in Haight-Ashbury during that period. And what happened in the 1960s is there was a major breakout in culture where young people in particular were demanding change, and there was a lot of instability, as you know. And then it looked like it all went away. In the 70s and 80s and 90s, it looked like it all went away. But now what's happening is we've come to the first square, which is what's going on. That's the first square after the conjunction. And this is basically, as I said, 2012 through 2015. So what's going on is all of the issues that came to the surface in the 1960s that got stuffed, such as freedom, sustainability, egalitarian lifestyles, and all that stuff is coming back. And that's the reason the energy feels so strange. Then, on top of that, there's another issue here altogether, which is the end of the Mayan calendar, which you probably paid some attention to, the December 21st, 2012 thing. And what happened with the end of the Mayan calendar is a whole new field of energy is penetrating this planet. And if you watch closely, there's a lot of very, very good things going on. I'm seeing, like, for example, Obama's negotiations over Syria, and I know everybody's got a different political point of view, but we were on the brink of a third world war about 3 weeks ago, and it's not going to happen. And I could give you a whole list of things that are happening right now that appear to be very positive, and I would say that I haven't seen very many positive things for quite a while. And so we're in the middle of a major, major level of transformation and change, and it's never easy. There's no way that this level of change is easy.
Well, I'm looking at the clock. So if people want to get your book because they want to learn about their cycles, Astrology and the Rising Kundalini, where can they go look for it?
It's like Amazon and Barnes. I don't know which bookstores are in business anymore, but I use Amazon just because it's easier. It might be in your local bookstore. Frequently they are, but I never know these days. You know how that is because you got books. And then there's handclow2012.com and my website. And what I'm doing on handclow2012.com is I'm giving free analysis of these Uranus square Pluto transits that started in 2012. Because the energy is just so intense for people that I'm giving a whole explanation of how it's working and how people can handle it, because it's just very, very difficult. So I'm doing that on the website, and this book just came out. The novel's going to be called The Ruby Crystal, and hopefully it'll be out next year.
Well, yay. Barbara, thank you so much for coming on. I always love having you come on.
Yes, I love to talk to you.
So, but you have a great evening, a wonderful weekend, and I will talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks for the support.
Thank you. Oh, you're welcome.
Okay.
Bye. Bye. And that's Barbara Hand Clow. Her book is Astrology and the Rising Kundalini. It's just jam-packed with good information. Her website, handclow2012.com. And we'll be back with Denise Lynn after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.